It takes me a while to make sense of things. It seems I rarely have a full appreciation for what's happening in given moments, and only in retrospect am I later able to see the significance of things. Now, this may be a conversation I had with someone, a meeting, or even a kind gesture for someone else, that it's not until I'm telling the story to someone else do I realize what a profound impact it had on me. As an example, a few years back, the United Methodist Church had all its candidates for ministry do an assignment they called River of Life. For this project, you were to draw a river on a large sheet of paper, and in it place stones or branches of people or events that led you to the point we all found ourselves. In our case, we were all exploring this feeling that God was calling us into ministry. Now, I'm not a craft guy. And doing these kinds of things like journaling or Pinterest-like spiritual exercises is not usually my thing. But this assignment was required, so I had to. and I didn't really have much of a choice. So I began to make my river and put the bigger, more obvious stones first. My mom, dad, wife, kids, some army stuff, which I'm all sure played some kind of role in shaping a call to ministry. See, but then my mind began to turn to smaller events for whatever reason, like a conversation I had one evening after a hard day on Fob Salerno with Chaplain Doug Yoner, who in the middle of a general conversation about our kids and life in general asked me if I ever thought of being a pastor. And I had not so much as even recalled that night until I had to do this assignment, but I went ahead and drew a stone in the water and titled it Doug Yoder. That memory triggered another memory long before that one of being in high school and having a science teacher named Jim Curzon at Tuslaw who ran Fellowship of Christian Athletes at our school and asked me to lead a Bible study one time. No one had ever asked me to do anything like that. Again, not something I had thought about for years, but there it was, so I drew another rock in my river and named it Mr. Curzon. When another student, discerning his call to ministry, sitting right next to me, looked up and said, "Hey, you have Mr. Curzon and yours too?" And Ryan Cockrell, who's a pastor at Janaden Hutton UMC and was a couple years behind me at Tuslaw, had the same experience. It was impactful for me to realize the spirit in these moments when I'm not paying attention. I bring this story up, one, to remind you that you never quite know the impact God will make through you when you're living faithfully. I'm not sure what Mr. Curzon, though, thought that his impact would be, but oftentimes when we're just facing down situations or trying to do the most faithful thing we can do in a moment, God kind of takes care of the rest, right? Or at least sends others to help, too. The second, more relevant to our text today, is that John is writing this story about table flipping in retrospect. And there are not many moments in our Gospels where we get such a clear view of the mind of the writer than this one. Jesus causes a scene in the middle of the temple on one of the holiest days of the year. John tells us Jesus saw people selling cattle, sheep, and doves with money changers seated at their tables. Can you imagine the smell of the place, just for one? Can you hear the commotion of people talking, bartering, feet shuffling past each other on the dusty ground, while still yet others remove the animal feces that was building up, and just the dull roar of crowd going about their business? Now, I don't get the sense that any of this was a problem for any of the disciples, let alone John, as this would have just been a part of the Jerusalem experience, the big city experience. After all, they all in likelihood have been there before. Maybe even purchased a dove or two from some of the merchants, probably even had their own opinions about where to get the best deal. See, but Jesus begins to fashion a whip of cords. The tension of the moment begins to rise. What's he doing? They got to ask. And it says he drives them out, all of them, from the temple, and those vendors must have been scared enough of him, because it says that he poured their coins on the ground right there. Now imagine how scared you have to be to leave your hard-earned livelihood behind. Scared. And it would seem that the disciples didn't know what to make of this moment, of this whole encounter, because we don't get any words from them. We do, however, understanding that John is writing this text, the newest of our Gospels, some 5 decades after it happened. We get little tidbits like, his disciples remembered that it was written, for your house, zeal for your house will consume me. Or, and perhaps more telling, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples had remembered what he had said this and believed in the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. See, it doesn't tell us what the disciples were thinking in that moment, unfortunately. And oh, I would love to have been a fly on some cow dung that day to see their faces. Money changers gone, tables piled up against each other and turned over, and coins sat in the standing water of the cold stone ground, while pigeons sat in their cages, molting feathers, and sheep weren't quite sure what to do, and cattle just sat there chewing their cud as if nothing just happened. It's a rare thing that the same story, like this one, is retold in each of our 4 Gospels, but this is one of them. It obviously had an impact on the disciples, and it was probably something they talked about a lot, even after Jesus was gone. In all likelihood, it's probably what got him killed. They probably had conversations that, in retrospect, things like, do you remember that time that he chased that merchant out of the temple? Do you remember the look on their faces? And all those feathers that went flying. It probably took dozens of conversations like this for them to make sense of the whole ordeal. What did it mean? There's a refrain that occurs a lot in our household. Not sure about your own, but with our 4 kids in the house, it's a common occurrence to leave a perfectly clean room with 3 boys playing kindly to come back in a matter of minutes and go, what the heck just happened here? This is where the disciples are the day Jesus drove out the merchants. What just happened? John, in retrospect, gives us 2 answers in his gospel. One, Jesus had a passion for God's house, and that Jesus wasn't just talking about the building. Let me explain. See, sheep, doves, and cattle were necessary for people to take into the place in the life of the temple. They would have traveled long distances to get there and would not have brought their own animals, so they had to buy them. To make matters harder, you had to exchange any Greek or Roman coins you had because you couldn't use them in the temple because they had a human image of emperors on them, so you needed the money changers, just like you went into any foreign country today. And these money changers, just like today, likely took their fair share for this service. And we may look at this now and say, well, that's terrible. That's why Jesus was so upset. But when we say things like that, we get focused on the little things. We don't fully grasp that this would not have been out of the ordinary for anyone. It's also very likely that Jesus, even as a child and an adult, Jesus himself would have been there before and walked by these very same set of circumstances. But then he comes and literally turns the tables, doing arguably during one of the most important days of the year, so that the whole system of temple worship comes to a halt. What are you doing? They ask. More specifically, it says, they ask, show us the sign that you have the authority to do this. And he responds to them, telling him of his own death and resurrection. And they were going to completely misunderstand. But what Jesus is telling them is that while their unjust system, that frankly was taking advantage of people, their way of manifesting God's presence in the world was broken. He is not merely focused on the consequences of this system, but the whole structure itself. It's systematic. God's presence was not to be reduced in this way. And in pointing to his death and resurrection, he says, my whole life will bear testimony to the power of God. Benjamin Wayman, pastor of St. Paul's Free Methodist Church, recounts the times the prophets protested and flipped the tables of oppressive rulers, unjust laws, and degrading social systems and exploitive policies and government-enforced idolatry. He says that the Bible is full with examples that included Shiphrah and Puah's civil disobedience to the Pharaoh's command to kill Hebrew boys in their birth in Exodus 1:8. He talks about Moses' plagues to protest slavery in Exodus 5 through 12, or Isaiah's naked protest for 3 years, mind you, against Egypt and Ethiopia in Isaiah 20. Or Ezekiel's protest in packing his bags and staging an exile in Ezekiel 12, 1 through 16. Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's refusal to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue in Daniel 3. And the list goes on, right? See, the people of God protested a world that fell short of God's shalom and loving creation. And one of the things that the story we read this morning can show us, and while I know that in Sunday school we were always told to play nice, get along, and never raise too much fuss about things, and just be the good, do no harm Methodists. But that's all fine and good. But if sometimes I think if rather than seeing dissent or protest as an exception to the rule of a normal Christian life, Christians could see dissent as a part of our necessary witness that Jesus is Lord in a world that lives otherwise. See, as Christians, we should dissent to people who disparage the image of God in other human beings. We dissent to policies and practices that fall short of love of neighbor. We dissent, protest against systems and patterns that exploit others. We dissent to the politics of a world that killed the very author of life and is dead set on killing his disciples. And while we have seen a lot of anger already this year, and the last thing I think we need is more of it, I think in this case, Jesus shows us the right things to be angry about. It's not anger for anger's sake, outrage just for public appeal, or the turning of tables as some kind of PR stunt. See, instead, we find that Jesus drove out the forces of oppression, of mistreatment, of misappropriated priorities, instead set a new table for which all people are welcome. A table set to liberate us from the captivity of sin and death. A table of hope, a table of sacrifice, and a table of love. So in that spirit, let us now come together to that almighty table of love.